All right. So thanks a lot for the invitation. So today I'm going to talk about this piece of work, the joint work with a student of mine, Brian Heikema, who presented this at the Calling last year, I think it was December. And the paper has this playful title, is Map Decoding All You Need. And it's so because it discusses how inadequate it is to use a certain popular strategy for forming predictions, producing translations, using a neuro-machine translation model. And though the focus of the talk really is on the particular case of machine translation, I could see many arguments being made for other sequence generation problems that are approached with models similar to NMT, at least from the point of view of the statistical design of the model. Yeah. Right, so let me start with sort of an overview of what's going to happen, right? So the key takeaways. We are going to question the way that predictions of translations are formed in neuro-machine translation. And the general strategy to predict translation goes by this name of map decoding. I'll talk more about it in a bit. I will essentially show that map decoding introduces biases that the model itself does not necessarily have, that the most probable translation, that is the mode of the distribution and the objective of map decoding, is a rather infrequent outcome and can be considered rare, as I'll show you. And that NMT models interpreted as probabilistic distributions that they are over the sample space of possible translations of a certain source sentence do reproduce various statistics of observed data relatively well. I will test a few of these statistics and I'll show you. And thus we argue that this decoding strategy, map decoding, is in fact not suitable for NMT. And that we should base the model criticism and also our predictions on unbiased samples.
Hey, Wilker.
Wilker?
Sorry to interrupt. It seems like your screen is frozen.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Hold on.
We still see the title screen. And you're on the open speaker notes menu or something.
Hold on, sorry. Let's try again. I think it's because I'm not set up with a single screen today. So a fair game. Sorry about that. Do you mind if it's not full screen? There will be a bar at the top, but then then I'm sure that I can at least see what you're seeing, and then I know that we are on the same page.
No, now it's looking good. We're seeing your mouse move and everything.
Yeah. Okay. So all right. So basically, I was talking about these takeaways, right? The key takeaways that map decoding introduces biases the model doesn't necessarily have. The mode is a very rare outcome, as I'll show you. And that many statistics, or a few statistics that we tested of observed data, are captured rather well by NMT models. And then we argue that map decoding is not a suitable decision rule for NMT, and that we should base model criticism and also predictions on unbiased samples instead. So I'll do a quick overview of NMT, mostly just to set some, because later I'm going to have to refer to some objects and concepts so that we are speaking the same language. But it would be very brief because you're all very familiar with it. So NMT is a probabilistic model, meaning that as we observe a source sentence, we predict an entire probability distribution over all possible translations of that sentence. Now, this object distribution over all sentences is far too complex to predict in one go. So we predict it a little piece at a time. And this means that each time we use a neural network to predict a categorical distribution over the next word in a sequence, given all available context, the source sentence and the target prefix. So this means that we use the same neural network over and over and over with different inputs to predict the probability of with which any one of the known tokens may be sampled. And then when we get to fit the parameters of this model, we turn to maximum likelihood estimation. That is, we choose it such that we assign maximum log likelihood for a model given a data set of observations. So see that this formal objective is not a decision boundary. It's not a separating hyperplane. So it's very different from an FPM. It really is a probability distribution whose samples are presumably to be faithful to the observed data. When it comes to translating with NMT models, the typical strategy then is to output the translation that has maximum probability or least surprisal, if you like, under the model. And that is the mode of the distribution. So in the context of generative models, where this comes from, the decision rule used to go by the name of maximum a posteriori. It comes from a joint distribution where there was a posterior in the formulation. NMT as such doesn't have a prior and a likelihood in a posterior, but still we inherit the name. So we're going to call this map decoding. And the thing with map decoding is that the search space is unbounded here. Even if you put a limit on how long the translation can be, that is a really, really huge number of translation candidates. And as the model does not make any Markov assumptions, it doesn't lend itself to any way to organize this search in a nice dynamic program. We cannot really search exactly, at least. And instead, we are going to use a local strategy, local search strategy like a 3D search or beam search. One point I want to stress here is that NMT is not trained for predicting translations. It's trained for predicting a distribution over the space of translations, one that from which would likely sample the observation. So that's the interpretation there. But no point during training of the model, these particular objectives on the slide constrained or shaped the search for parameters. And as we shall see, this will lead to some interesting or puzzling problems that we're going to have to deal with. So this slide is about really about a whole bunch of papers that have made crucial observations that I'm calling here the pathologies and biases of NMT. Observations that altogether led to a stream of research papers on what's wrong with map decoding, including our own paper. So NMT has been said to exhibit a number of pathologies, or NMT models should suffer from a number of biases. For example, there is a lens bias, or the observation that NMT outputs are often shorter than human references. There is a beam search curse, or the observation that as we invest more into search with bigger beams and explore a much larger space and potentially making far fewer search errors, translation quality deteriorates or degrades rather than improves. There is the inadequacy of the mode. It wasn't called like that. We decided to call it this way. We thought it would represent well what the problem is. Or the observation that the true mode of the distribution is awkwardly inadequate, oftentimes being the empty string. There is a paper now from 2019, Stolberg and Byrne, that show it very clearly, very convincingly, that in many cases, the true mode of the model is the empty string, suggesting something is certainly wrong with the model. Beam search compares hypotheses from left to right. So it compares partial or incomplete hypotheses without regards to their future costs, something we use to estimate in days of SMT. And so there are some strategies to compensate for that, to make up for that, such as lens penalty, reward, or lens normalization, that make hypotheses a bit more comparable. Their effects are hard to analyze, and overall they lead to what we call a non-admissible heuristic search, which introduces biases of its own. And there is an exposure bias that concerns the potential mismatch between training and testing. Just the fact that during MLE training, we present a neural network with data samples, and when we form predictions at test time, we present a neural network with model samples. And there may be a data distribution shift over there with potential biases without further. The one thing I want to highlight is that most literature blamed NMT as a model, say its factorization in terms of locally normalized distribution, or its training algorithm, maximum likelihood estimation, for presenting the learner with data samples rather than model samples, for example. But an important remark to be made is that these observations were really made where approximate map beam search was used to criticize the model. So if crucially beam search is introducing biases that do not belong to the model, we've been attributing those biases to the model inadvertently. So I hope to show you that map decoding is indeed partly to blame, as it distorts model beliefs. So there is a bit of blame that should have been decoding, or rather it's approximation beam search. Other both. So let me talk about bias statistics here. So we use the mode for model criticism, that is to appreciate a pattern in the model output and attribute that pattern to model design or training. But we also use the mode to essentially criticize. So we also use the mode to present to users. So we use it both for model criticism and we use it for making predictions. The thing with the mode is that it's not an unbiased summary of the model. So for example, say a mode is really short, say the mode is the empty string. That does not have to mean that the model as a whole underestimates average sequence length. Perhaps if I sample from the model a number of times, I'm going to estimate average sequence length very reasonably, perhaps even capture the entire length distribution. We also target the mode for making predictions and showing it to the user. As our distributions are defined over an unbounded set, or something very, very large, the mode may still be pretty rare, so infrequent, despite it being the most probable outcome. And that can be quite counterintuitive, but I hope I'll have some illustrations that will convince you that being the most probable doesn't mean that you will observe it most likely. I'll try to explain why that is the case. And the thing with focusing on the mode alone is that it disregards valuable information that the model had to learn, or that it presumably learned, that is coded in the distribution, in the relative importance of the outcome. So to investigate, we set ourselves up to investigate these three questions. So does the NMT model fit the data well? Is something we're interested in. What do the learned distributions look like? And can we make predictions using all of the information available? Now, basically, there will be a whole bunch of experiments, and I'll explain how the different components of this experiment are aimed at the three questions I showed you. But throughout, we're going to be talking about English paired with German, Nepali, and Sinhala in both ways. The first English-German is our high resource pair, tested on news tests, so on a WMT test set that's relatively in domain with the training data, meaning the training data does contain some news in it. And for the other two pairs, those are our low resource pairs. They're tested on the Flores data set, so this is rather out of domain with respect to the training data. So you should expect sort of blue scores of very different magnitude. So they're not going to be blue scores, I believe. For model, we used a transformer model. Now, let's begin by assessing data fit. And assessing data fit is a matter of model criticism. So to criticize the model, we need a compact way to appreciate the model's belief, which we're going to get from unbiased samples. So the key notion here is that of an unbiased sample. It's a sample from the model distribution as such. So we can obtain one of those by following the generative story of the model. As the model is a chain of categorical draws, we essentially do so by assessor sampling. So we start with the empty string, conditioned on the entire source sentence. We predict a categorical distribution for the first step. We sample a word for that step, extend the context, and repeat the process. We follow the exact definition of NMT as a Markov. And a summary like that is seen as unbiased because it's really only aimed at reproducing statistics under the model. There is no notion of external utility that we are trying to satisfy. Now, a model that fits the observed data well is a model whose samples reproduce statistics of the observed data. So to assess that, we are going to gather some relevant statistics from different groups. For example, human references, from unbiased samples, and from the beam search output of that same model. And we will then model these statistics themselves under a hierarchical Bayesian model and compare the posterior distributions over certain latent parameters of this model. These parameters, the parameters of the analysis model, they will govern statistics of the human references or statistics of the model outputs, and they will allow us to make a more direct comparison. We're going to focus on three aspects of the observation: their length, their unigram and bigram counts to appreciate some lexical properties, and also some skip bigram counts to appreciate some aspects of word order. And a skip bigram is just a bigram that is potentially non-adjacent. So in the nice dog, the dog is a skip bigram. We would like to get much more sophisticated statistics in data space. That would be difficult, say trigrams, 4grams, 5grams, because they grow very sparse. That's already why we are using a Bayesian model, because these statistics can be sparse. but I think these three already capture some interesting phenomena. Right, so this first version model has a parameter that controls the average sequence length of each one of the groups of observations we have. So which groups do we have? We have human references in blue, model samples in green, and beam search output in red. So see that it's one model throughout, used either, which we explore either via ancestral sampling or via beam search. Now the plots show the posterior distribution over these parameters, the parameters of the analysis model. And the overlap with the posterior distribution for references indicates a better fit to the data. And that's what you see in the x-axis, overlap with the reference group in terms of average, the parameter that controls average sequence length. So more overlap there will indicate that the model output is more human-like in this regard. So for example, in most cases here, what you see that the model captures length, model as explored via ancestral sampling. So the model's statistics capture length reasonably well, often overlapping with the reference group. And that is beam search that shifts from data statistics. So confirming here a finding, a robust finding in the literature that beam search tends to underestimate sequence length. But here we then try to show you that it's rather beam search and not persist the model as a distribution. This second Bayesian model that indicated by the two rows in the center of the plot compares the distribution of unigram or bigram counts. The first one unigram, the second one bigram. Of each one of the test groups, say reference samples or beam, and it compares those to the corresponding lexical distribution of the data used to train the NMT model. So the interpretation of the x-axis now is a little different. It reflects a notion of agreement with training data statistics. So a shift to the right indicates that that particular group is more training-like along the dimension of unigrams or bigram counts. So we would like to see groups overlapping and placed towards the right of the plot, the right-hand side of the plot. So in most cases, what we see again is that the model as represented by samples captures lexical statistics reasonably well, not oftentimes, but sometimes overlapping decently with the references. And they are here to the right of the plot. And that beam search appears towards the left, indicating that it's less training-like along the dimensions of unigrams and bigram counts, which also corresponds to a finding in the literature that beam search outputs tend to overemphasize sequence groups, changing lexical characteristics of the data distribution. Now, this final Bayesian model focuses on skip bigram counts. It's essentially the very same as the bigram counts, but now with a different data that reflects statistics of skip bigrams. And the interpretation is the same. The x-axis is a degree of, is a notion of overlap with training data statistics, and being placed towards the right-hand side of the plot is a good thing. What we see again is that the model captures words that, as represented by samples, does capture word order statistics reasonably well, and that oftentimes it overlaps with references. But beam search again shifts from data statistics affecting now word order. So the trend is more or less the same for all statistics, but do keep in mind that as we go down in through this plot, they're getting sparser and sparser, so the analysis is a little bit hard. So we asked, does the NMT model fit the data well? And I would summarize this by saying, answers by saying that beam search shifts the distribution of statistics such as length, unigram, bigram, and skip bigram counts away from human references or training data. And biased samples seem to better reproduce those statistics. So I would say that models fit the data better than beam search outputs would have suggested. Let me now turn to question 2. It had to do with properties of translation distribution. So I'll start by summarizing the model now with a very large sample, say 1,000 sensor samples, and appreciate some general properties in there. Starting with a notion of spread. So the x-axis here shows you the number of samples at a certain point, and all the way to 1,000. You're going to sample 1,000 times from each one of these three models. I'm showing one direction, but the findings go both ways. And on the y-axis, I'm showing you the cumulative probability of unique samples. So how much probability have I gathered if I add all the probability for the unique samples in the set? So and the solid line you see is the mean across all test instances, while the bar shows you one standard deviation. What you can really see there is that for English German, the first plot, which is our high resource pair, less than 10% of the probability mass is covered, even after 1,000 samples have been drawn. So that's not a lot of probability mass. For low resource language, the situation is far worse. It barely gets to a percent point. So this means that NMT is predicting distributions that are relatively flat over a very large set of translations, at least 1,000 in this case. Any translation within this set is still as infrequent as 1 in 1,000, and none of them should be preferred over another because of their probability values, which is the criterion that beam search would have used to elect a winner. So I'm not claiming that none of them is to be preferred. Certainly some translations in there must be better than others, but not because of their bare probability value, their raw probability. Let's inspect this.
Hey, Wilker, sorry to interrupt, a quick question.
No problem.
So how do you compute the probability? Is it probability over a sequence?
The probability of the sequence, yes, that's right.
And that's basically the sum of each individual decision?
Sure. For the sequence, it's the product of the decisions. Yes.
Oh, the product of this. Yeah. Okay.
Yes, and for the total cumulative mass, then it's a sum.
Okay. So you don't worry about normalization over something.
No, not at this point. No. Yeah.
Okay.
Because
right,
the hope is to characterize the set rather than improve the search. Normalization would be useful for searching.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. No problem.
But so to follow up on that, shouldn't there be some incorporation of length, for example? So I mean, you'll capture with a fixed number of samples, you'll capture more of the mass for shorter sentences than for longer. I would think.
Yes.
Just because there's fewer. Okay. Yes. But I guess okay, so maybe you don't need to do that because this is just a corpus level statistic.
Yeah, exactly. So the point is, I would consider normalization for search. For making a statement about how spread out the distribution is, then I wouldn't, because that is precisely an effect we see here. Length causes this distribution to have higher entropy indeed and be flatter. Yeah.
Okay.
But the point stands. If the model predicts a flatter distribution, then that is what it is. It's not because it's flatter or more concentrated that on its own should give credibility to the mode, right? In fact, being flatter gives less credibility to the mode, if that is to be, that's the point we can make. Because then any small tiny perturbation in scores, in model probabilities would elect a new mode. It's part of the point in this that the flatness here is the problem.
Okay, thanks.
But we're going to keep investigating this set and see if it's only bad news. No, spoiler alert. So let's see if the mode is in the set. So we use the mode for criticism and we predict the mode, or well, an approximation to the mode, we give it to the user. Let's see if the mode is in the set. We do not compute the actual mode. That would take the expensive procedure that Stolberg uses to investigate whether the mode is inadequate. Instead, we use the beam search output. So we are checking whether the output that we actually use to criticize models and present to users is at all in a very large sample. In this case, containing 1,000 translations sampled from the model without external utilities. Now, for most sequences, the beam search output is not amongst 1,000 samples. This shows that the model is actually expressing very little emphasis or support for the beam search output, the output which we, in the end, use for model criticism. Prior work has shown that the mode is often the empty string. And so we look for the empty string. Is the empty string in the set? And it's not often amongst 1,000 samples. In fact, when it did occur, which was for about 35% of our input sentences, it occurred only once. So even though it is potentially the most probable outcome, it's less frequent than 1 in 1,000. So even though it's the true mode, it's potentially the true mode, it's not a frequent problem, I argue. And I'm going to show you how we can overcome the empty string, basically by exploiting the fact that it's unlike any other string in this. So I keep saying that high probability does not mean high frequency, which I genuinely find a puzzling statement. So I hope some of you also find it puzzling. So I'm going to try to clarify it. The answer really lies in the factorization. So I want to give you a visual indication that high probability does not mean high frequency when you are sampling a large discrete combinatorial space. So I plot here the log probability of the samples. Okay, so I get the samples that are full strings from I gave a particular source sentence and I got full translations, and I compute the log probability of those translations, and I plot a histogram. So the x-axis is log likelihood. You might already find this a bit weird. When you look at the plot, the blue bars, so the histogram, is concentrated somewhere which is not at the maximum, which is not what you expect. If you sample from a categorical distribution 1,000 times, you expect the histogram to peak at the maximum log probability, which would be the rightmost point in the x-axis. It's not happening here. It's bumping somewhere farther, a little bit farther from the mode. So I indicate with dashed lines two other, there are three, but let's concentrate on two other outputs. The dashed blue one is the reference, the actual translation. It has a log probability that is somewhat smaller than the maximum log probability that this model can assign to a string. And the beam search output is the dashed red, which happens to be the most probable one in this set. So I want you to see how the bulk of samples concentrate somewhat far from the most probable sample, which is the beam search output here, which really tells you that the model expresses less support or less preference to the beam search output than it does to a vast number of translations that have lower probability. These translations have similar probability values to one another, and they likely share lots of statistics as parts, subparts, perhaps, or substrings in the translation. This happens because an MT factorized probabilities along the sequence, and sequences are not atomic. They are in fact very correlated outcomes. They're very dependent outcomes. I think a couple more experiments will show that even more clearly. There is something called an asymptotic exportation property. It's a property that certain Markov processes exhibit. They concentrate, they show a concentration of surprisal, which is the effect I showed you in the previous plot. If you're familiar with the notion of typicality, it has to do with that. The surprisal of a sample trajectory is typically within a margin of the entropy of the process. And that's why it can't go to the maximum. It has to stay somewhere else close to the entropy. This is more likely the case the longer the trajectory gets. And effectively, this means that the sampled outcomes will live in a small set, and it's small relative to the total sample space. It doesn't have to be small in raw terms. And most likely, the mode is not in that set. That set is a set that is typically known as typical set, commonly called the typical set. Concretely, it would tell us if the AP holds for an MT, it would tell us that the longer we expect a reasonable translation to be, for example, because we are conditioning on a very long source sentence, the more inadequate map decoding should get. The thing is, I personally don't think the process whose translation kernel is given by an MT can be shown to have an AP. I cannot prove this property myself. I have been trying, and I am failing to prove certain key properties of a Markov process. And I'm beginning to think that it can't be proven for an MT. But that doesn't mean I cannot test for it empirically. So I live with the fact that I cannot prove that the AP holds, and I test whether it holds. So what I'm showing you here on the x-axis is kind of a p-value. It's the probability that a sample will be more surprising than the beam search output. And if I estimate that, and this is the subset of the test set, I didn't get a time to run it for the entire test set. You see that the p-values are very high. So most samples will be more surprising than the beam search output. Close to 1, really, all samples, which really says that the beam search output is atypical. It's not at all in this typical. And you see the correlation with length, right? As the sentence goes longer on the y-axis, you have more and more samples falling far and far and farther from the beam search output. So the beam search output being less and less typical. I think this is a nice empirical, it's a nice way to illustrate an empirical version of the AEP or NMC. Now, if this set is relatively large, it's at least as large as 1,000 sentences, but it's also relatively small compared to the entire sample space. And this is a set that you will likely observe if you sample from the model. So these are the sentences that the model believes in, so to speak. So what can be said about the quality of the sentences? Let's abstract away from properties that are about the model, survival, score, and focus on properties such as quality measured by a metric. So here now, to try to appreciate the quality of the hypothesis that we can sample from the model or hope to ever sample from the model, we will again sample a number of hypotheses, and this is shown on the x-axis from 5 to 30. And then we're going to select amongst these candidates the one that is most similar to the reference. So I'm going to get a kind of an oracle criterion and see what is the best selection I can make if I knew the reference. And I'm going to compute that in terms of sentence level MC evaluation metric. I picked Meteor just because I don't like to smooth blue at the sentence level. In hindsight, I should have picked maybe other metrics. I'll show you later what happens if I change Meteor for something. And then I'm going to report on the right, on the y-axis, the corpus level Meteor score of this oracle decision rule. And I'm going to repeat this experiment a number of times to see if there's a lot of variance. And you see that there isn't a lot of variance. In blue, dashed blue, I show you the beam search performance, which is a proper decision rule. It's not cheating. There are no references in beam search. And then what you see in the box plots is that it's actually, you can outperform beam search fairly quickly, and showing that there is potential in the set of samples you obtain with some bias ancestral sampling, no top K, no nucleus, no length normalization. We're still left with the job of actually designing a criterion to find the good hypothesis, especially a criterion that doesn't require a reference, and that's looking to that. But back to the question, what do translation distributions look like? They are not particularly peaked. They do not show a clear preference for any of the translations in a large set, and the situation gets worse in low resource settings. They do not seem to emphasize the mode, nor the empty sequence. Instead, map decoding or beam search does. And they do support translations of reasonable quality, at least potentially, which we checked with the Oracle decision rule. So we're going to try to claim, though, that potential with an algorithm, now perhaps a viable algorithm. So we've seen that mode-seeking search introduces its own biases. We've also seen that the most probable translation is not particularly supported by the model. So next, we're interested in deriving a criterion that exploits the distribution as a whole, or at least a summary of it, expressed by ancestral samples. One such criterion from days of SMT is minimum Bayes risk decoding. So it tells us to look for a hypothesis that maximizes the expected utility under the model, where a utility function here will capture the aspects of the problem that matter for the decision maker. So translation quality for us. I'm going to decompose this expression. So it's telling us to find a hypothesis H that maximizes a utility U. For example, Meteor or something else that reasonably decomposed at the sentence level. And the idea is that we want to pick the hypothesis that maximizes Meteor or our preferred utility. But we don't have access to references, right? So we cannot compare H to Y. What we do have access to is the model of the references, which is the NMT model. And we have a model that can fill in the references for us stochastically at a certain probability. And then we can pick the hypothesis that leads to highest expected utility. So that is MBR if you were to solve it exactly. It has some interesting properties. It makes use of the translation distribution as a whole because the expected utility is an aggregate statistic. we can approximate it using unbiased samples, right? So you can MC estimate the expectation. And it doesn't suffer from many of the pathologies and biases of beam search or map decoding, which I'll try to convince you of. So, for example, it doesn't actually suffer from length bias. If sentences are shorter than expected, you can blame it on the model. It's a matter of bad model fit or your choice of utility. Perhaps you go for a precision-oriented utility, but it's not per se an algorithmic search bias. Let's think about the beam search curse. Here, more computation in the form of more samples actually improves the estimates of expected utility, and that will likely lead to better translation. I'll show you later that it turns out to be the case. There is no inadequacy of mode because MBR is not mode seeking. And the algorithm is actually robust to occasional pathologies as long as they are not consistent. So for example, if the mode sneaks into the set of samples, that is okay because the mode, if the empty string sneaks into the set of samples, it's probably okay because the empty string is not going to be any similar to other strings in the set, which expected utility will tell you. It doesn't, exposure bias is again a matter of exploration strategy. And because MBR uses ancestral sampling, it uses the model distribution. So even though there can be still a shift from model distribution to data distribution, there is no shift from model distribution to the distribution induced by exploring the model via beam search. And finally, there is no need to compare partial hypotheses. So there is no non-admissible heuristic search bias to worry about. You explore whole hypotheses instead. So there are a few clear advantages there. Do they pay off when you test them? Mixed results. So we test the sampling-based rule or an approximation of it using 30 samples, both for MC estimation of expected utility and for making a hypothesis space. So concretely, this means we get 30 candidates sampling from the model for every candidate against every other candidate in terms of some utility meteor, and then pick the best. Here we report beam search, MBR decoding, and the Oracle decision rule so that you can appreciate the potential of the space. And we use meteor, sentence level meteor as our MBR utility. So you see the high resource, the low resource setting, and all language. So these are averages. That's high resource because we only have English German there. And then what you see is that beam search outperforms MBR in the high resource setting. I'll show you in a bit what happens if I increase the sample size. But for now, this is what you can see there. That's what you saw in the paper. If you check it, you will see in the paper. And that MBR decoding outperforms beam search in low resource settings. And this is nice because in low resource settings, we saw that the distributions were flatter. So there was a way to recover from the uncertainty that the model expressed in the model output by introducing our utilities. And does the model—
Wilker, oh.
Yeah.
Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you up. I was just gonna, I'm curious, maybe you'll get to this, but what if you use something like nucleus sampling instead of this full ancestral sampling? So
yeah.
It seems like you wouldn't have the go ahead.
Yeah, I can make 2 comments. It's not in the paper and we have only preliminary results. If you use it for MC, let me go back 1 slide. Here, if you use it to estimate the expected utility, you bias everything and potentially you suffer from inadequacy of the mode problems because it's mode seeking. Even though it's stochastic, it's mode seeking, which means you might boost the probability that the model assigns to something like the empty string. So that's not desirable. Where I think there is a good space for it is in defining the hypothesis space. What hypotheses are you comparing? You see, because now we have these 2 decisions. Enumerate a hypothesis space. That could be done by nucleus sampling. For the hypothesis in that space, assess, estimate, expected utility. That I would do with unbiased sampling. And though I don't have the data to support the claim, I indirectly have access to it. There has been at least one occurrence of MBR in the NMT literature, and they use the beam both to enumerate hypothesis space and to estimate expected utility. And the effect they saw was exactly that no matter how large it was still pretty bad. All the biases remained. And that's because if you bias the estimation of expected utility, you are back to the inadequacy of the mode problem. That's how I would explain it. Yeah.
Thanks.
So if I go back to this one, then in low resource settings, it seems to pay off already with 30 samples. But we are really interested in seeing if this can become an algorithm that one could apply generally, right? Regardless of language pair. Because if that would be the case, then we could start asking ourselves, what are the utility functions we truly want to maximize at decoding time? And that would then become something pretty interesting. I think the community would love to have. We see that the gap with the Oracle decoding is, well, Oracle decoding is really large. So there should be room for improvement here, algorithmic improvements, if we can sample more or consider a different utility. So I'll give you, this is not in the paper, this is ongoing work. I'll give you an indication of what can happen. So we tried both things. We increased sample size from 30 to 300. And we also aim at different utilities. In the first half of the table, the left half, I'm aiming at Meteor during MBR. My utility of choice is Meteor. In the other half, I'm aiming at beer. So the utility of choice is beer. And then I'm reporting the corpus level performance now across 3 metrics so that we appreciate what happens to other metrics when we emphasize one of them during decoding. Very natural question to ask. And what we see is that, like I promised you, more computation pays off. So more samples improves search because you get better estimates of expected utility. Your notion of what is good improves. Now, if I move from Meteor to beer, you also see that improvements are more, they appear through across metrics. So if I had to pick a metric to decode with, and my 2 choices were Meteor and beer, I would go with beer because I can improve across different metrics. And that might be explained by the simple fact that, you know, in hindsight, I went to check the WMT and I found out that beer had way better segment level correlation with human judgment than Meteor had. And that's why now I'm picking beer here. I should actually, by today's standards, I should probably try something like Blurt or Comet, because then maybe I'm going to be able to improve this even further. What is so these are the upshots. What's the problem here? The problem here is that MBR decoding scales quadratically in the number of samples. It takes n squared assessments of utility, and 300 squared is quite low. So this is the bottleneck that we have now, scaling up MBR. And you see that in many cases, you might still say, well, I would rather go with beam search, because in terms of the final metric scores, well, we don't actually improve or improve only marginally. I'm going to give one argument to sort of counter that, but the hope for the research program, at least as we continue, is that we'll show that distributional properties of MBR outputs are better, even if perhaps the scores are similar to beam search outputs. So what I mean is that there are fewer pathologies in the output, but this work is not complete, this next step of the analysis. So if we go back to question 3, can we predict translations using all information available? Yes, we can use a few unbiased samples. They already offer a hypothesis space with great potential. And unlike probability, expected utility is a good criterion for prediction, at least in principle. But someone once remarked that I cannot say that probability is a bad criterion because beam search is still very good. But then I want to remark that beam search is not all about probability. It's a sweet spot realized by the interaction of probability, lens penalty, lens normalization, and search errors that we control by a small beam size. And there has been quite interesting papers investigating this very aspect, trying to code these hyperparameters as a form of inductive bias of beams. I'll comment on that again in a bit. So to summarize here, we argue that we should not be doing map decoding in NMT because MLE trained NMT does not imply map decoding. So there is no sense of optimality. There's no sense in which map decoding is the optimal decision rule for an MLE trained model. Map decoding further biases our conclusions about NMT. So we end up blaming the model and seeking model change that were actually to be attributed to the search algorithm and maybe didn't take the change we must have. Besides, map decoding is intractable, and its algorithmic approximations have a cascade of non-trivial effects. MBR is also intractable, but perhaps with simpler procedures to approximate some of these computations. Translation distributions do capture the 3 statistics which we tested well, and it would be nice to test for more. That's probably a research line. And as we've shown that sampling-based decision rules have great potential, their algorithmic approximations are more friendly, except for the fact that we still need to live with a quadratic assessment, number of assessments of utility. Before concluding, I want to mention a few ways to address or circumvent the inadequacy of the mode. These are really not exhaustive, but these are some that came to my mind and I would like to share. Regularizing beam search. Note that most of these strategies are quite recent. That's because this is gaining popularity. So you can go for less mode seeking, like nucleus sampling. You can exploit patterns in surprisal distribution. That's Clara Meister's work. You can also look into mutual information as a form of adequacy during decoding instead of utility, as in empty metrics. You could use mutual information. There has been a couple of attempts at external utilities by voting schemes that are similar to MBR, and by energy-based re-ranking that are a bit less similar to MBR, but go in the spirit of sample then re-rank. And otherwise, we go back to the model and we try to include search in training, right? So then we can go all the way back to learning a decision boundary during training. Or we can look into this more recent line of work, sparsifying output distributions, because as they turn sparser, the typical sets become smaller, and then the reliability of the mode increases. We might be able to live with beam search. Outside MT, I think I want to highlight the fact that MBR only requires a sampler. So there's no need to assess model probability. This can be a big asset. For example, in paraphrasing, we cannot assess the probability of the paraphrase because we chain 2 and MT models together, and we cannot afford to do the summation over all pivot strings. So in a situation like that, the ability to get by simply via sampling and assessing utility rather than assessing surprisal is actually quite interesting. And for other natural language generation tasks, we may not even have, well, we may have different notions of utility that are less and less related to model probability. So we may find tasks where we, for example, care about diversity and creativity, and we might be able to quantify that somewhat, but not really by using surprisal model probability. I think there is a potential impact there or something to be claimed there. And the way forward on our side is we are looking into better sampling-based decision rules. We are trying to speed up MBR. The bottleneck is the number of assessments of external utility. We're trying to get that down to linear with some success. We're also interested in utilities that better reflect our ideas of quality. And most likely this will mean not one, but many utilities. And then I'm going to have to look into optimizing vector valued functions, as I chatted with Kevin earlier. And then other rules, I'm not aware of other rules, but I'm looking for them. And finally, maybe bring this whole thing into parameter estimation. So some notion of utility calibrated training, perhaps not too unlike research of 2016 on learning to search in neural models. And that's it. I hope I didn't go over time. I'll take questions.
No, great. We still got plenty of time. So thanks, Wilker. Maybe we should attempt an applause. Always awkward over video. But thanks for the talk. I guess we have some time for additional questions if there's anybody who would like to ask a question. I could actually start out with one while other people think of any questions they have. I guess we had a number during the talk, but so you have this, I think I understood right. So the metric you're using for MBR, you varied, you used Meteor and Beer, and you mentioned you could use other ones, maybe Chirf or modern neural techniques. I wonder if do you think it'd be possible to actually use the n-dimensional decoder state at the final or anything a bit lower level like that? Is it possible it would, or even like you could take a laser embedding? I guess maybe this is the same thing as doing Comet or something. I just wonder if, I mean, you mentioned this a little bit, if there's any potential better metric for that's less surface-based,
The decoder state that difficulty would be, we would need at least one final transformation to map that to a single utility, or a handful of utilities, but let's say a single one. And that would have we would need to learn that. We would need to train that somehow. Not quite like that, but perhaps related. We have been considering, we haven't done much yet. We can try to use the decoder state to predict what the expected utility might be. And that we can simulate training data for. And you can simulate as much training data as you want. And that would turn MVR into, from ON squared, it would go to ON, because the assessment of expected utility would be O1. You give the string to, say, a neural network, an MLP, and it's, or not the string, you would give the internal state of the decoder, and it would say, hey, this is the expected utility that I imagine you would obtain if you computed an MC estimate. So that seems like a super interesting way to speed things up. It doesn't per se give you a better utility, though. I think we're stuck with the problem of having to either design better utilities or learn how to optimize towards multiple utilities at once, which might be the best idea, right? Because we won't find one single metric that addresses all of our quality concerns, but we may have 10 that together give a good, capture enough insights, get enough insights.
Did I hear somebody start to ask a question?
Oh, I was going to ask one, but it sounded like Kevin might have one too.
You go first.
Okay, so this isn't quite perfectly thought through, but for a lot of the analysis at the beginning, am I wrong in making it, thinking it's a lot of the problems are very similar to problems of model calibration?
No, you're not wrong at all. It's very similar, yes.
I guess if you could comment a bit on that. And then the other question I had, I don't know if you all tried this. I'm curious if you have thoughts on the effect of different kinds of augmentation, if that affects this. I could see in some ways that maybe could, without having tried it, I could see it making it worse or better if you had run it with back translation. So I'm curious if you have thoughts on that as well.
Okay, so let me go in order then. On the issue of model calibration, so indeed, model calibration aims at reproducing the observed frequencies in the data. So if we have a good strategy for improving model calibration during training, then indeed you would expect the samples to better reproduce the statistics, so even better. Now, if you criticize the model still via a mode-seeking, an output obtained by a mode-seeking algorithm, you're not criticizing per se the model, you're criticizing the mode of the model. So you're demanding two things of your model. On the one hand, capture the frequencies, the observed frequencies. On the other hand, make sure you capture all observed sequences at the modes of their corresponding decisions, given a prefix and a source sentence, which is a harder task. That said, label smoothing seems to somehow achieve something like that. There is quite some evidence that it does that. It sort of improves the ability of the neural model to capture observed frequencies. It does have a lot of very bad side effects in sampling performance, not per se in translation performance. Translation performance by a beam search actually is often about a blue point better for many languages and many benchmarks. So it seems to be a robust finding. But it does have lots of other negative effects on sampling performance, which puzzles me a bit. I train a probability distribution, but my objective seems to destroy the probability distribution in some ways that you would expect to use it. So there is a bit of an investigation to be done there. I don't have a full answer in that space of interaction with label smoothing, especially with regards to calibration properties. As for the augmentation, I now can't quite remember. I think in the calling paper we didn't have augmentation, so perhaps we do not have back translation data in the English-German data set, but we do have in the low resource data set. The thing is that the low resource is so low resource that without the back translations we can't really present a distance model to you. So it would be better to actually investigate the effect of, for example, having back translation in a higher resource pair, such as English-German, and for that I don't have an answer. I'm actually not entirely sure whether it's now part of our current investigations. I'm inclined to say it's not. I think we're still not using it in the high resource setting.
Thank you for your answers. That was interesting.
Thank you.
Sanjay, it looks like you have your hand up. Maybe you can.
Let me jump in really quick. Yeah. So I think you sort of, Wilker, started motivating this whole thing by saying, like, the mode is often not the right answer, and you invoked AEP and other things like that. And you gave actual evidence of how, like, the empty string is often the most likely. But to really push the argument forward and say that's the real issue, what I'd like to see is something like the following. The notion of AEP used is what I call entropy typical. There's a stronger notion of typicality, which is based on types, but you're not invoking that. You're invoking the entropy typical sequences. Right?
Yeah.
And that's why you made appeals to ergodicity and whether. Yeah. So the thing is, you can probably get a decent estimate of the entropy rate of this process from sampling. I mean, I don't know how reliable these estimates are, but let's assume that you could do that, right?
Okay.
Then can you show me that the reference translation or the reference translations as a set, if there's more than one, are within some appropriate epsilon ball of the entropy rate of the process, right? And then I'd believe you that, okay, maybe that's what's going on. Yes. And so there are things like that, because when you started showing results with MBR, you're confounding two issues.
Yeah.
Right. And one of them is the fact that you're doing MBR, which of course is directly related to the task metric rather than likelihood. So of course I expect improvements. So,
absolutely.
Like, this picture I thought was okay, but not super convincing. So I'd like some statistics.
Yes. I'm gonna comment on this. So this is part of the ongoing investigation. Yes. And there it's nice because then I can also include strange things like label smoothing and the effect downstream that it has in the model as a distribution. But yes, absolutely. So here, sketchy for one sample, I'm showing you that I think it's the yellow one or the blue one. Now I have to read the blue one. The dashed line is the reference, and you see that it's closer to the bulk of mass than the red one is, which is our approximation to the mode. Now, I am systematizing this plot and getting you the statistic you want, and I'll show you in what shape it will come, something like this. So I can compute this p-value, right? The chance that a sample from the process is more surprising than anything. Say, for example, the beam search output or the reference. Now, because I know the mode is not typical, I expect this p-value to be close to 1 for the mode. It's completely removed from the typical set. I expect this p-value to be close to 0.5 for the reference because I want the reference to be right in the middle of the typical set. So the distribution of this statistic will tell me whether the reference is within, how did you call it? You didn't call it typical. You used a better term that I need to search for. Entropy. Entropy typical, did you say?
Yeah.
Entropy typical. I like it. Yeah, I'm going to look for it.
There are two notions of typicality, and there is a Chisar notion, which is sometimes called strong typicality, where all the joint statistics have to match. And then this is a weaker one where you simply say the average log likelihood should be close to the entropy rate.
Yes, and that's the one that I'm talking about. Exactly. So I can also look into the entropy rate, though I do not expect good approximations there, but I would have to check. I do think this estimated p-value that I have is a very common predictive check in Bayesian statistics. And I think it applies here just fine. And I think it gives us a good picture because if it is about 0.5, then the reference is surely right in the middle of the typical set, right? And then I can also look at the magnitude of the differences, and then perhaps that is also interpretable.
Right. And then there's another little correction you may have to make, which is that empirical estimates of entropy are typically underestimates.
They are underestimates, yes.
So you could adjust for that a little bit, but there is literature on that. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, let me stop. I think Kevin and others had more questions, and maybe Ding.
Thank you for the question.
It's cool to hear about information theory these days. So
Kevin,
I just have
I'm teaching it next semester. Kevin, I'm teaching it next semester if anybody wants to take it.
Cool. Yeah, I miss those days. Anyways, I just had a general question for you, Wilker, because I know you worked a lot on search in the statistical MT days as well. I'm just wondering if you have any general comments on how things are similar or how things are actually different now that what's the search problem in terms of search problem? Is it different or similar, or any just general comments?
Search was more fun in days of SMT because we could do more. The model factorized in ways that allowed us to exploit more machinery than we have now. So now search is far more challenging, right? Because we can never count on, we cannot count on any dynamic programming to really make a huge difference. But I can say a few things. So I think in SMT, we used to have a handle on future costs. And I'm arguing that surprisal doesn't really matter. All we need is sampling. We don't need to assess the probability of things because that's not the utility we want to optimize. But there is a notion of future cost that I would like to have, which is future cost with regards to the utility. So if I have a prefix, what is sort of my estimate of my expected utility of the possible ways to finish this translation up? If I would be able to get that, then I will be able to bring beam search into this argmax. You see that right now, my approach to this argmax is simplistic. I sample first 100 times, and then I estimate the objective for each one of these 100 samples and rank them. So that is very simplistic. I don't get to revisit my search upon assessing utilities. So then I would see two directions. One is either building in estimates of expected utility based on partial incomplete hypotheses inside of the search, and then I can do beam search. Or, and you're the person I can kind of like give you hand the question back to you, or find a way to do global search, right? With a technique like, I don't know, Bayesian of T. And I can tell you that the way to speed this up, one of the ways to speed this up is actually by borrowing ideas from Bayesian optimization, and something Brian is looking into to reduce the comparisons from n squared to n. But that doesn't buy us a way to build the utility into the search, which is something I think would make this all the more exciting and bring us a bit closer to how we used to do search for SMT. And moreover, I think would take us to the next step of decoding algorithms, like decoding algorithms that will be steered, controllable, if you like, by the choice of utilities we make.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds cool. Thanks.
Thanks for the question.
Hey, I have a question about the way you do MBR decoding. I was just like, when you introduced this, I was thinking another way of doing this. So right now you estimate the quality of your hypothesis using a reference-based metric, but also like to do, because you don't have that, you don't have the reference, so you do some sampling to generate estimation. I wonder if you also think about, instead of using reference-based metric, use reference-less metric, which is one of these QE metrics. And I mean, previously they're not that great, but you know, there has been a lot of improvements on these metrics these days. So can you comment on, like, do you think that would do better, and what's the trade-off doing that instead of doing sample?
Yeah, on the one hand, if we could trust our QE metrics, that would be brilliant, because it would abstract away from this quadratic number of utility assessments. It would be down to linear. It would be really good. Even better, then we could actually train this thing on partial hypothesis and sort of be able to build it into the search. So I see a lot of potential there. Problems. QE is a trained system, right? So when decoding is something we're going to do anywhere where we deploy our system. So we're certainly going to be querying our metric with out of domain data, and moreover with model outputs that we are not yet sure are pretty good, right? We are trying to rank them. So we trained on a certain domain, on a certain genre, and on our very best outputs, because the models that compete are all very good. And I'm a bit worried about bringing a trainable component like that into the MBR algorithm, where we are comparing candidates of varying quality for domains that are likely different than that of the metric. And that's partly one reason why I am not fully excited to use BLERT or COMET, for example, as a utility, not quality estimation, but as an MC evaluation metric, just because they're trained. Here is trained too, and it worked well. So perhaps I'm too worried about that. There was one more aspect I wanted to comment. Yes. The other aspect that is interesting, I saw recently a trend towards unsupervised QE. So QE where they exploit model uncertainty estimates, right? And then I gave it a shot. It's not super systematic, so I can't promise it works, but it looks like expected utility is pretty good at estimating quality. So if I rank my candidates by expected utility, if I compute expected utility and I plot on the one axis the oracle quality as given by meteor against reference, and on the other axis expected utility, I see a clear linear correlation. So that is really nice. It means that if I invest a lot of computation, I actually get good uncertainty estimates. It's a bit strange because this is not uncertainty in parameter space, it's uncertainty in output data space. I didn't expect for all of that, but it looks like there is indeed a connection here between QE and expected utility as such, for whatever utility you put in there.
Okay, I guess actually we're pretty much out of time. There's one more quick question we could ask it. Just jump in before I finish my sentence. Otherwise, let's thank Wilker once more. Wilker, thanks for taking the time to visit us. And
thank you very much.
Great. Thanks.
That's a really great question. Yes. Have a nice day over there. Yes.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks,
okay.
Wilker.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.